Brother Jane. So I now call on our Brother Brian to come forward and speak to us on Ishmael and Islam and the purpose of God.
Thank you, Brother Justin, and good evening, brethren and sisters, young people and friends. I'm sorry that our brother Adrian's not here tonight. I was looking very forward to the Revelation study, and unfortunately he's hurt his back and is not able to be here. So at short notice, a few of us have filled in. And so tonight I thought we'd look at this subject of Ishmael and Islam in the purpose of God. You may still have Psalm 83 open on your lap there, and you'll notice in verse 6, it speaks there about those who are confederate against Israel, the tabernacles at Edom, the Ishmaelites, Moab, the Hagarenes, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also has joined with them, and they have helped the children of Lot, and so on. So there is a list of enemies who were determined, as it says there in verse 4, come, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may no more be in remembrance. I'm pretty sure that most of us would have heard words similar to that on the news from time to time, but not by these particular people, but by modern versions of them, haters of Israel. If you've seen the news recently concerning the Palestinian problem, the Palestinians, of course, have been determined ever since they've been there to force the Jews out of Israel and force them back into the sea. That's their aim. Now, in verse 6 there, it speaks particularly of the Ishmaelites, and that's our subject for tonight, because Ishmael was a very important person in the life of Abraham. In fact, he was Abraham's firstborn son. If we go back to Genesis chapter 16, turn your Bibles back to Genesis 16, we will see there a promise made to Hagar. In Genesis 16, verses 10 to 12. This is to Hagar, who was the handmaid that was given by Sarah to Abraham, because Sarah was unable to have children. God had promised Abraham a seed, as you know, and Sarah was not able to produce that child as far as they understood, and so she gives to Abraham Hagar, her handmaid, to be his wife. And so as a result of that, Sarah, or Sarai as she is here, becomes quite jealous, and she starts to persecute the handmaid, and the handmaid flees from her. So in verse 10 of chapter 16, the angel of Yahweh said to her, return to thy mistress, verse 9, and submit yourself under her neck, under her hands. And the angel of Yahweh said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, and it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of Yahweh said unto her, behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shall call his name Ishmael, because Yahweh hath heard thy affliction. And so here we are introduced for the first time to the firstborn son of Abraham, who, she is told, and she's out in some wilderness area, she's fled from her mistress and her husband, basically, and she's been approached by the angel of God. Given this information, she's going to have a son, and she's to call his name Ishmael. Not only that, but she says, the angel says, he shall not be numbered for multitude. Now, they are important promises made to Hagar. Well, she does go back, of course, and informs Abraham, no doubt, of the meeting with the angel. Abraham was well encountered with what had happened by Hagar. And so when we come to chapter 15, not chapter 15, to chapter 17, we see there in verse 20 and 21, God said to Sarah thy wife, verse 19, this is to Abram, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. And so after some years, it says that he was 90 years old when this happened, whereas before, when the angel appeared to Hagar over in chapter 16, he was only 86 years old. So 4 years have passed in Abraham's life where he's believing that Ishmael is the promised seed. Because when he's born, what does Abraham call him? He calls him Ishmael. Why did he call him Ishmael? Because the angel had said to Hagar, his name is to be Ishmael. So Abraham listened carefully to the words that Hagar repeated, those words of the angel. Well, when of course, the angel comes to Abraham here in chapter 17 and says, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son, in verse 19, you can imagine the reaction of Abraham, because for the last 4 years, Ishmael has been the promised seed, and he's had the expectation he's going to become a great person. He's harking back to the days of Genesis 12 when God made the promise to him originally, and we quote that, we learn that's fundamental, the promise to Abraham. And so Abraham is believing that Ishmael is the one. Well, as it turns out, he wasn't. And we know, well, I assume we know why he wasn't, because the seed of promise was to be produced by miraculous work of the Father, not by the works of man. And so that work of Sarai in the beginning in giving her handmaid to Abraham to bring forth the child, ultimately Ishmael, led to continuous problems, not only for their family, but for Israel forever after. And that problem that was created by Sarai's intervention really in the purpose of God in giving Hagar to Abraham to get that promised seed was a disaster. And today, the Palestinian problem with Israel is a result of that original disaster. And it's been going on for the last 4,000 odd years, because right through our Bible, we find that the Ishmaelites became the inveterate enemies of the Israelites. And so we will see in our study the Abrahamic blessing on Ishmael, as we've already covered, the relationship of Ishmael and Esau. Esau, of course, is the son of Isaac. Jacob and Esau, the two boys. Once again, there's enmity between Esau and Jacob, we learn. But Esau and Ishmael are related through marriage later on. And the tribes that come from Ishmael and Esau are the Arab tribes, which today, of course, are giving Israel so many problems. Arab development in the time of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad's brought into the picture because up until Muhammad, the Arab nations, the Ishmaelites, were a diverse, divided people. They were completely tribal. They were family-oriented. There were hundreds and hundreds of families of them all over the Middle East. And they were worshipping different gods. They were pagans. And there was no unity amongst them. We'll see why that is. Muhammad and the rise of Islam, therefore, we'll have a look at, because it was Muhammad that brought those tribes all together into one huge family. And they were united by the religion of Islam. We would be familiar with the Islamic State, the problems that the Islamic fundamentalists are producing in this world today. Once again, it's a result of the problem created when Hagar or Ishmael. We can have a look, if we have time, at the latter-day Islamic Arab-Israel relations briefly, and God's future blessing on Ishmael's seed, because you see Ishmael and his seed and that great multitude that will follow are part of Abraham's seed. And God promised that they would become a great nation, and they will. They are already, and they will in the kingdom as well. And we'll see that not only will Israel be raised up to the head of the nations, but the seed of Ishmael, which are the seed of Abraham, will also be elevated with Israel in the kingdom age. So the blessings of Ishmael are in Genesis chapter 16, verse 2. We've seen that in verse 12 it says he will be a wild man. His hand will be against every man, and every man's hand against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. How true did that come to be? He certainly was a wild man. That word wild man there is actually translated in the rest of the Old Testament as a wild ass. So he had the characteristics of somewhat of a wild ass roaming in the deserts. And he certainly was a wild man against every man, and every man's hand was against him. And he did, and still does, dwell in the midst of his brethren, because the Ishmaelites never moved out of that Middle Eastern area as we know it today. Israel was there, and they were continually, right through history, in that area surrounding and round about Israel. In Genesis 17:20 we read, "As for Ishmael, I have heard thee, behold, I have blessed him." God says to Abraham, I have blessed him. I will make him fruitful, she has, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. And those things have all come to pass as the promise was made. So we'll just trace now briefly the tribes that came out from Ishmael. In chapter 21, you turn over a couple of pages, in verse 6, says there, Sarah said, God hath made me to laugh, so that all will hear and laugh with him. And he said, who would have said unto Abraham that Sarah should have given children suck? For I have borne him a son in his old age. In verse 21, we read, he dwelt in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. This is after Isaac is born. There is problems once again with Hagar, and she flees away into the wilderness. And it says in verse 19, as she fled away, that, or actually in verse 18, arise, lift up the lad and hold him in thine hand, for I will make him a great nation, God says to her. And God opened her eyes in verse 19, and she saw a well of water. As she went and filled the bottle with water and gave the lad to drink. This is Ishmael. And God was with the lad, and he grew, dwelt in the wilderness, and became an archer. And it says that his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. In verse 21, yes, and his mother took him a wife out of the land of Egypt. So that was the first of Ishmael's wives, but he had a few others. Now these are the generations in chapter 25, turning over a little bit further, tracing the history of Ishmael. In verse 12, these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid, bare unto Abraham. These are the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael, Nebaioth, and Kedar, and Abdil, and Mibshan. Mishmar, Jumar, Massa, Hadar, Timar, Jeter, Naphish, Kedemah. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their towns and by their castles. 12 princes according to their nation. Isn't that interesting that Ishmael has 12 sons? And Isaac, of course, the tribes of Israel have 12 sons, same. And so once again, the promise to Isaac and Jacob through Abraham is paralleled by the promise that God makes to Ishmael. And so out of Ishmael comes 12 sons, 12 tribes. Now, are there any names in that list that sort of jump out maybe at you a little or not? In the name of the sons? There's one there that particularly stands out because it recurs time and time again. Kedar, that's right. The Kedar is really referring to the Arab nations that we know in Arabia particularly. There's Arab nations all over the Middle East now, and they're not all Arabians, but in those days, the ones that settled down in the Arabian Peninsula became known as the Arabians. They ultimately became known as the Arabians, but they were those that dwelt in the tents of Kedar. And so that map there gives us an idea of where the seed of Ishmael, the Ishmaelites, lived. They dwell from Shur towards Assyria, up near the top there, all the way down south towards Havilah by Egypt, down there at the beginning of the Red Sea, right down the bottom. So they're over that full area, covering from north to south. And of course, in the middle there is the land that was promised to Abraham, the land of Israel, really from the river Euphrates over in the east, right across to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. So they're surrounding, those nations are surrounding the land promised to Abraham, which of course he never received yet. There was a connection between Ishmael and Esau. Now they're 2 generations apart, right? Ishmael is the uncle of Esau. And so there's 2 generations there. But Esau takes 2 wives of the Hittites. He takes more wives of the Hittites and the Hivites in Genesis chapter 36, you can see that. And he also takes, records in Genesis 28, a woman named Bashemath or Mahalath, it's the other name, who is the daughter of Ishmael. So there is now a royal family connection between the line of Ishmael and the line of Isaac. And they are brought together with these 2. And it's significant because Bashemath, the daughter of Ishmael, bore Reuel, of whom several dukes of Edom came. Now the dukes of Edom were basically the principal kings of the various cities that the Edomites set up. And the Edomites, later on in the history, became the most persistent and most fatally bad enemies of Israel. They were consistently against Israel and taking advantage whenever they could of the disadvantage or the calamities that came upon the people of Israel. The Edomites were there to get in and see what they could get out of it. So they were certainly wild men. The second son of Ishmael was called Kedar, as we've said. And in Psalm 102, we don't need to turn these up, Isaiah 60, Ezekiel 27, the tents of Kedar are measured or are mentioned. And in Ezekiel 27, Arabia and all the princes of Kedar are combined together. So you see, what that's telling us and what we learn from history is that the people of Kedar, the second son of Ishmael, moved down into the Arabian Peninsula. And in Isaiah 21, Jumar, Timar and Kedar are named as enemies of Israel. Once again, they are all Ishmaelites. They are the seed of Ishmael. They are wild men. They are desert dwellers, they are tent dwellers, and they hate God's people, Israel. They did then, and many of them, let's not say all of them, but many of them today do. So the Arabian links to Ishmael. The term Arabian first appears in the time of the kings. As we read through the record of the kings in 2 Chronicles 17, in chapter 21 and 22, the Arabians are mentioned there. It simply refers to a dweller of Arabia. So, when we talk about Arabs today, we're not really talking about people that lived in or live in Arabia. The term Arab today is a complete polyglot of many, many different nations who have all intermingled over the years, and there's every nation in the Middle East and elsewhere mixed up in what are called Arabs today. But the land that the Arabians had here is still very much Arabian today. The Arabians have maintained a very strong bloodline through their tribes in Arabia itself, and they probably are true Arabians, most of them. The Egyptians, fairly likely to be Arabians, but a lot of the other ones to the north, particularly up in Iraq and further over in Persia, were probably not Arabians at all, but they certainly still hated Israel. They were desert dwellers, camel breeders. Arabian became a general term incorporating Ishmaelites as well as other tribes. Arabians were always the enemies of Israel, and so maybe if we had a look at 2 Chronicles chapter 26 verse 7, just to see that. And we'll have a look at Nehemiah also, because they were certainly opposing the rebuilding of the walls in the days of Nehemiah of Jerusalem. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 verse 7. It says, from verse 5, God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of God, and as long as he sought the Lord, God made him to prosper, and he went forth and warred against the Philistines, and brake down the wall of Gath, and the wall of Jabneh, and the wall of Ashdod, and built cities about Ashdod among the Philistines. And God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians that dwelt in Gur-baal and the Mehunims. And so this is in the days of Uzziah, and then the Arabians from time to time are made war against by the kings of Israel. Manasseh later on did the same. And if we have a look over in Nehemiah, in chapter 4, Nehemiah chapter 4, we find that the Arabians once again are showing their colours against the rebuilding of the walls of the temple. In Nehemiah 4 verse 7 it says, "But it came to pass when Sanballat and Tobiah and the Arabians and the Ammonites and the Ashdodites heard that the walls of Jerusalem were made up and that the breaches began to be stopped, they were very wroth, very angry, wild men, wild asses. And they conspired all of them together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to hinder it." So that's the character of the Arabians in our historical record. There was also those which were called Hagarites, which were sons of Ishmael. Enmity as the Israelites entered the promised land, it was recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and verse 19. It says, "And they made war with the Hagarites, with Jeter, Nephish and Nodab." And then in chapter 1 Chronicles 5 verse 10, in the days of King Saul, that enmity continued, and it says, "And in the days of Saul they made war with the Hagarites." So Saul does later on, many, many years later, in the days of the kings. and they fell by their hand, and they dwelt in their tents. This is the Hagarites, once again, Arab tent dwellers throughout all the east land of Gilead. Let's have a turn to our reading for a moment in Psalm 83. This is one of the last of the Psalms of Asaph, pleading for God's intervention at the hands of those who were taking advantage of Israel. Israel had been taken into captivity into Assyria, and at this stage it seems that Babylon was ready to take away the Judeans, and Asaph was lamenting at the way that the Ishmaelites were coming in and taking advantage of their very dire situation. And so in verse 2, lo, thine enemies make a tumult, they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They've taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. They've said, let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may no more be remembered. Now, we read that earlier. This is in the days of the invasion of Israel by the Babylonians, because, of course, Israel were wicked and God was determined to take them away. And so when they were on the lowest ebb and they'd been facing siege by the Babylonians and so on, and their other cities had been taken, Lachish had gone, and other cities had been surrounded by the Babylonians, these Ishmaelites, these people who are listed in verse 6, came into Israel and saw what they could take. So they helped themselves. Asher has joined, they've helped the children of Lot, and they've come in basically taken great advantage really of Israel when they shouldn't have done that. Now God condemns them for that later on. And so the psalm goes on in verse 14, as fire burns a wood, and as the flame sets the mountains on fire, so persecute them with thy tempest and make them afraid with thy storm. Fill their faces with shame that they may seek thy name, O Yahweh. That was the prayer of Asaph in writing that psalm against those who were coming in. But you'll see at the last verse of that particular psalm that it has a future application. It's not only based on the events that happened around the invasion and the fall of Israel and the taking away into captivity and the destruction of the nation by the Babylonians, but it has a future application as well. And you'll see there that when those nations listed there are dealt with by God, let them be confounded and troubled forever, yea, let them be put to shame and perish, that men may know that thou, whose name alone is Yahweh, art the most high over all the earth. Now that, of course, is a future application. That will happen. But it won't be those particular ones. It'll be those who in the latter days they represent. And they represent still the seed of Abraham, the Ishmaelites, those who around Israel today hate those people and want to force them out of Israel back into the sea. They'd like to see the last of them. And so we've come up to the point of the Babylonian invasion of Israel. What happened was, of course, the Babylonians finally took the city of Jerusalem, was besieged, eventually fell, and the Jews were taken into captivity to Babylon, where they remained for 70 years. Some of them stayed there for good. A lot of them returned with Nehemiah and Ezra to rebuild Jerusalem after the 70-year captivity ended. But the fortunes of Israel never recovered, because they were now under the iron hand of the Babylonians at first, or actually not really when they went back to Jerusalem. They were under the hand of the Medo-Persians, because the Medo-Persians came in, they took Babylon. Cyrus freed the Jews to return back, so they are now under the rulership of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Persians. Well, they remained under that for a long time until eventually the Greeks came, and they were under the hand of the Greek Empire. So they still did not have sovereignty. They were vassals of the mighty world power. And when the Greek Empire fell, it was the Roman Empire that came along, and we're getting up in history close to the time of the birth of Christ. So during that long period of time, from BC 586, the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians. Israel lost their nation, their identity. But what we don't see there is that so did all the other nations around Israel. They also lost their autonomy, if you'd like to put it that way, their autonomy. They were no longer free to do as they pleased because they came under the hand of those world powers. Daniel's world powers, you know the ones, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece and Rome, they all suffered under them. Medo-Persia, Greece and Rome followed the domination of all the Arab countries round about. Edom is obliterated from history after 125 AD. Who would they have been under in 125 AD? Who would have obliterated their memory out of all history, do you think? Rome, wouldn't it be? Be the Roman Empire, wouldn't it? Remember? Because in 125 AD, this is around about the time of the second revolt of the Jews, and Hadrian was in power, and of course the Edomites were actually rather involved in some of that, as it turned out, because Herod the king was an Idumean, which means an Edomite. He came to power by the grace of the Romans, and he became made king of Judea. And so when Jesus was born, Herod the Great was the king. He was an Edomite, and so the Edomites were there for a while, but after AD 150, or about 125 actually, the history of Edom ceases. It no longer exists. And Edom is gone as a nation, doesn't exist anymore. The interesting thing about that is that in the prophecies concerning the restoration and the last days, Edom gets mentioned time and time and time again. You think, how come? Because they don't exist anymore. Well, you see, what happened is that Edom has actually become, or come to represent, the nations who oppose and hate Israel. And so you could say that the Palestinians are a modern day Edom. The Iranians, who would be delighted to see Israel forced back into the sea, are modern day Edomites. Because Edom today, if you go there, there's nothing there. The cities of Petra and so on are places where people go to visit and have a look at the wonders of that place, but it's all finished. It's not there. But the spirit of Edom is there amongst those who hate Israel today. And when the prophecies speak about Edom, they're speaking about those nations who surround Israel, who would see them obliterated from history as well. Well, interesting that after the Roman conquest of Judea, and then the AD 70 when Jerusalem was destroyed, and then again about AD 130, the second revolt happened, and you might have heard about Masada and the last stand there. The Jews fled wherever they could to get refuge from the Romans. They were getting away. And one of the places where they obtained refuge was down in Arabia, in the Arabian Peninsula. It's a huge area. I don't know how to fit on Australia, but it would cover South Australia and probably part of Northern Territory as well. It's a big, big area. And there were Jews down there seeking refuge amongst the Arab tribes that were there. And so that was from about the 2nd century, from 150 AD, 130 AD, right through until the rise of, what brings us through to the rise of this man called Muhammad, or Muhammad, is it there? It's spelled different ways. Muhammad, the meteoric rise in 622 AD, unites the Arabian tribes into a mighty marauding army. And why are we interested in this? Well, brethren and sisters, young people, we're interested in Muhammad because you see in Revelation chapter 9, Jesus' last letter to us, he speaks about that man's meteoric rise in symbol. A meteor is a shooting star. It's very bright for a little while, it burns itself out and it's gone, and that's exactly what Muhammad did, as we shall see. Now there's a map of the Saudi Arabian Peninsula as it was in 600 AD before Muhammad came on the scene. And those little names on there are some of the individual Arabian tribes who lived in the desert, family groups, tribal camel breeders. They were involved in the trade routes that crossed that area. Trade routes came through that area from over in India, from up in Mesopotamia, and they went through into Europe. And so it was a very important crossroad, really, part of the Arabian Peninsula for all of those trade routes that were going in that era. There's one city there called Najran. It's got a little yellow circle around it down the bottom there. I've circled that because in about 300 AD, we talk about Jews fleeing down to Arabia to get protection from the powers in the north. There was Christians fleeing down there in the mid 300s and 400 AD to seek refuge from the persecuting powers back up in Israel, and perhaps in the area where the Apostle Paul preached, because when the Roman Catholic power came to its zenith at that point in 312, those that opposed the doctrines of the Catholic Church were being persecuted, and they could flee as well. So Christians moved down there, and for a period from about 350 AD there was Christian tribes there. But what happened there was the Jews didn't like the Christians, and they massacred about 20,000 Christians there and took that city, and it became a Jewish refuge. And so there was a lot of bloodshed in that period by warring groups of people, but surprisingly, Christian and Jews were there through several tribes in Arabia. They were not all pagans, assuming that we assume the Christians weren't pagans, but certainly the Arabs were. The Arabs worshipped a pantheon of gods, lots and lots of different gods. And in fact, in Mecca, they had a shrine there in Mecca which had 360 gods in it when in AD 600 at that time. And then along comes Muhammad. Muhammad, well, we'll see a little bit about Muhammad. He's an interesting character. That's his name, by the way, in Arabic. If you write Muhammad in Arabic, that's how you do it. And he was born in Mecca on April the 26th on 570 AD. So realise that when he's born in Mecca, there are Jewish tribes, there are Christians. They've got the writings of the Jewish book, they've got the Old Testament, they've got writings of the New Testament, and Muhammad is born into an area where these people exist. And obviously, in his 40 years that he was growing, he had contact with these Jewish and Christian people, because he came to believe that there's not 360 different gods, there's only one God, which was the Jewish belief. Well, interesting that he was orphaned, his uncle, and he was raised by his uncle, a man called Abu Talib. He became a merchant and a shepherd, and he married at 25 years of age. And at 40 years of age, so 15 odd years have gone past, he's been having dealings with, obviously, Jews and Christians in this period of time. He has a vision. The angel Gabriel comes to him. So he says, right, this is what he claims, okay? But the angel Gabriel came and gave him a vision and basically confirmed to him what the Jews and the Christians had been teaching him, that, hang on, there's only one God. Now, they wouldn't have been Catholic Christians, because the Catholic Christians were teaching at this stage there was three gods in one God in three. They were teaching the Trinity. And Muhammad did not accept that. Neither did the Jews, and neither did the Christians, who were not of the apostolic faith, let's say. If they were apostolic Christians, they didn't believe in the Trinity either. That's why they were there. Well, he's living in Mecca, of course, and his uncle was protecting him, because by this stage, at 40 years old, he's starting to proclaim some of these things. I've seen the angel Gabriel, and the angel Gabriel says there's only one God. His name is Allah, and we shouldn't be worshipping all these other gods. Well, he got on the nerves of those people there in Mecca, and they next thing they've got a price on his head. So Muhammad flees north to Medina, or Mithrab as it's called, was called. In 622 AD, he flees for his life with some of his followers, and they go up to Medina, where his one God doctrine is received, because, you see, in Medina, a number of the Arab tribes had converted already to Judaism. They were Jews. They were basically Jewish Arabs. And they all believed in one God. And so Muhammad is well received there. And he gains a lot of converts. And so in another 8 years' time, after he's been proclaiming this message throughout the parts of Arabia round about, he is getting quite a big following. And by 630, he's got enough followers to take 10,000 of them down to Mecca to say, you get rid of those 360 false gods out of there, or I'll have your throat, I'll cut your throat. And he was a very violent, they were violent people. And if people didn't do what they said, they didn't have any qualms about cutting their throat. As today, some of their followers, the Islamic State people, for example, very good at doing that. They'll cut people's throats if they don't accede to their demands. And so he comes down, he takes Mecca. Now it says there the Kaaba is purchased. Now the Kaaba, I'll show you a picture of it in a minute, is a building in which the gods of the Arabians were kept. And in there was 360, one for every day of the year. And Muhammad said, they're all false. His army got them all out. They wiped them out. They kept one. They kept one object. And it was a meteorite stone that they had found from heaven. They had polished it. And he kept that, and he said, this will be the symbol of the one true God. We'll keep that. That's the only thing today that is in that building in Mecca. So a couple of years later, Muhammad's dead. But what's happened? He's united all of those tribes in Arabia into one powerful military machine, basically. Medina, by the way, called Mithrab, was established as a town in Arabia by Jews, and that's where he went. So you see why you can see why there's a lot of parallels between Islam and Judaism in terms of their belief about God, and a lot of other things too, by the way, because half of their book, the Quran, is taken out of the Bible. So it's not like it's completely foreign. That's the mosque in Medina today. Quite a lavish building. So that's a modern thing. It wasn't like that when when Muhammad went there. There's the Kaaba in Mecca today. You've probably seen pictures of it. Just recently, 2 million Arabs made the journey to Mecca to walk around it. That's, every Islamist has to do that once in their life, supposed to, if they can. And so they go there once a year, just to open up again because of COVID. It had been closed down for a few years, but they had a huge number of people, over 1 million people, go and walk around that building. And in that building is nothing but the stone that fell from heaven, the meteorite stone, which is polished to represent the one true God. So Muhammad purged it. He got rid of all of that. The 10,000 men, they didn't have much opposition against them, and Mecca turned to follow Muhammad as well. All his family followed him, and they became devout followers of Muhammad's doctrine. The history of the Kaaba is interesting. It was destroyed by the Syrians in 682, not all that long after Muhammad had been there, really. It was rebuilt again in 693. In 930 AD it was attacked and the black stone was taken. But the black stone was returned in 952 after a large ransom was paid. And they got their stone back, and then some other things. In 1621 the walls fell down after a flood. Imagine a flood in Saudi Arabia, but there you go. And in 1629, it was rebuilt in black granite, as you see it today. That's a solid building. It was sort of a tent before, but now a very solid black granite building. So that's a most holy place as far as Islamic religion is concerned. So there's a map of the Muslim conquests that happened up until 750 AD. The dark green area in Arabia is the part that Muhammad actually during his lifetime consolidated into one mighty army. In Revelation 9, we see there's a description of locusts that fly out like a smoke out of the bottomless or the abyss, and they proceed into the north, into Syria, and then ultimately across North Africa, into Europe, over into Spain, and they're described like a swarm of locusts who completely consume and eat everything as they go. And then they disappeared after about 300 years. They disintegrated because they all had so many fights amongst themselves they couldn't decide who was the boss anymore. And they were taken over by Persians, actually, a different rule, still Islam, still Muslims, but it's not. But anyway, that's basically the conquest. And so the dark green is what Muhammad did. The four leaders that came after him, they were called caliphs, who came after Muhammad, expanded that rapidly. So that by 661, another 29 years, that light green area is completely Muslim now. They marched in with their armies. They said to the kings or the kings of the cities or the dukes or whoever they were, right, well, you're no longer pagan, you're now Muslim, and these are the things you believe, and there's only one God, right? You believe that? You accept that? Yes? No? Okay, well, we might let you continue if you pay us a large amount of money all the time, otherwise you'll be in big trouble. So they'd either kill you or take a large ransom in payment as a regular payment if you wanted to keep your religion. They were a little bit more lax or easygoing on that if there was money at the end. If there was no money at the end, well then you probably had to convert, otherwise you lost your life. So they were fairly, you can see how they expanded so rapidly. It was a huge expansion right across into Asia. And then look across North Africa, the polar part, up until 750, that's where the Muslims ended up, right over into Spain. See Andalusia over there in Spain, right up to the borders of France. And the only thing that stopped them was the Franks. And there was a man called Pepin the Short, who was the King of France, who managed to raise up enough of an army to be able to oppose those marauding hordes of Islamists, the Ishmaelites, as they came through, and they stopped them there. Later on, over in the east, they were going towards Constantinople. In fact, during that period of time, they tried 3 times to take Constantinople, but failed. They took a huge navy up there, and that navy was absolutely decimated by the Greeks who were in Constantinople. It was the Greek Roman Empire. They were Christian by this stage, under the emperors of the East, Christian Rome, Eastern Rome. They lost their navy. The navy was completely wiped out by what was called Greek fire. They had fire guns that shot fire, and they caught the ships alight, the ships burnt, and they lost thousands and thousands of men. It was a total disaster for the Muslims because God was not ready to let them take Constantinople. They never did, and they failed in all their attempts. So the Quran, well, you'd think, what about their holy book? That's the Quran. You hear about it. Well, it didn't appear until 150 years after Muhammad died. And it was made up of all sorts of bits and pieces. Bits out of the Bible, 19 of the prophet, we'll see that in a minute, 19 of the prophets listed are out of the Hebrew Bible. A lot of it was by third and fourth hand accounts, and Muhammad himself wrote a lot of bits and pieces on scraps of paper, on leaves, on stones, and they collected all those and they put the Quran together. And it's quite a unorganised series of statements and chapters. Some are 1 or 2 little verses, and other chapters of it are, or surahs as they call them, many paragraphs, many pages long. So the Quran is their book. Unbelievers, it says, this is one of the quotes, if you find this interesting, unbelievers are those that say Allah is the Messiah. That is, God is the Messiah. That is, God is Jesus, if you want, or Jesus is God. That's what they say. He says unbelievers are those that say that. The Son of Mary. Unbelievers are those that say Allah is one of 3. Trinity, you see. There is but one God, he says. If they do not desist from so saying, those of them that disbelieve shall be sternly punished. That's in the surah, so that's out of the Quran, right? So anybody that believed the Trinity was in the firing line of the armies of the Islamites, the Mohammedans. Of the 25 prophets listed in the Quran, 90 are from Jewish scripture, many ritual laws as well as civil laws of Islam parallel Judaism. They have a lot of the Jewish law. There's the Dome of the Rock. It's in Jerusalem. Most of you will be familiar with that, I would think. It's just interesting. So there's thousands of inscriptions in the ceramics in Arabic all around that building. And one of them says, it's on the outside apparently, on that frieze somewhere, it says, verily the Messiah, the Son of Mary, is the messenger of Allah. And the word of Allah that he gave to Mary and the spirit that Allah created for Mary, for Jesus to be alive. So believe in Allah and his messengers and do not say the Trinity. So why is that important to us? Because in Revelation chapter 9, when they are sent out to, in fact, harass and molest the Eastern Roman Empire, which is now Roman Catholic, the Caliph says, or the scripture says, don't touch the wood and the trees, the ordinary people. Just look for those who've got a special haircut, right? Those that have the mark of the Catholic priests. those who are Catholic. And so that follows from Revelation. It's very, very interesting to see the history of that. Well, the Arab-Israel conflict today, of course, is continuing on. We haven't got time to go into it in any length, but there are over 200 million Arabs today and only about 16 million Jews, so they're well outnumbered. And as far as the promise to Abraham was concerned, well, they are a mighty nation if you combine them together. Psalm 83 we've spoken about, and Isaiah 19 says that the nations friendly to Israel will escape the judgments of the latter-day Edom, Edom representing the haters of the Jews today. And so we've read Psalm 83, and in the final blessing of the sons of Ishmael we see in Isaiah 19, the Lord shall smite Egypt. They are Arab country, of course, and the Jews did that on several occasions until they got a peace accord with Egypt. They got a peace accord with Jordan. They have peace accords with the United Arab Emirates today. Israel has been able to reduce the threat of the Arabs in these last days, but there's still those who hate them. And so in the future there'll be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, from the south to the north through Israel. And the Assyrian will come into Egypt, the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians will serve with the Assyrians. They'll serve God in Israel, at Jerusalem. And in that day shall Israel be a third with Egypt and Assyria. Why? Because they are all the sons of Abraham. And God promised to Abraham they will be a great nation. Israel will be a great nation. Egypt will be a great nation. Assyria in the north will be a great nation. They are all the seed of Abraham, and God will keep his promise. The Yahweh of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance. And so I know it's a lot of history, and probably some of you find it a little bit overwhelming, but nevertheless, realise, brethren and sisters, young people, that the Israelites, they're there by God's purpose today. They've had a work to do. They've done that work. And the book of Revelation in chapters 9 and 10 particularly explain to us how that work was achieved. And you can read that. Thank you.